What's going on, my dear friends? Today in this video, let's learn and master the Angular framework's latest version. So let's get started. So guys, let's move on to the next lecture. So previously we worked on this event filtering. So in this lecture, let's see how to capture the input values that user entered inside this input field. For this, we have several approaches in Angular. So let's look at the basic approach. So which is capturing the data using the template variable. So go to the HTML file inside this input. First thing first, let's create the template variable. So how do we create a template variable? Very simple, just create a variable name with the hash symbol. So hash symbol and the variable name something. Let's assume this text field is for the username. So name the variable as user. So guys, this is the template variable. Now let's see what is the use of this template variable. In order to get use of this variable, we have to send this to the component TS file. So let's pass this to this keyup event binding method as a parameter. So inside this parenthesis, pass the template variable name user. Next, we are getting a compile error. Why is that? Now for this method, we are passing a parameter. So in order to prevent this error, we have to capture this parameter variable from this method. So go to the app component TS file and create a parameter variable. Inside this method, parenthesis, set this parameter variable as user, and this type will be, guys, with this template variable, we are sending an HTML input element. So set this data type as HTML input element. Awesome. Now inside this method, let's log this parameter so we can see actually what we are getting with this parameter template variable. So let's use the same log. So remove the log message and pass the parameter variable to this log method. That's it. So save this all and go to the browser. Type something inside this input and hit enter. As you guys can see here, we got this HTML input tag printed here. So guys, actually what is this? Guys, this is our HTML input tag, right? To verify this, let's set an ID to this input. Go to the HTML file and set an ID to this input tag. The ID value will be something user input. Now save this and go to the browser. Type something and hit enter. As you guys can see here, this printed the HTML input tag with the ID user input, which means this template variable is actually returning this actual HTML input tag. So now the question is, how do we capture the input tag's value? So guys, by default, all these HTML input tags have an attribute called values, right? Which store the input values of an HTML input tag. This is just a basic HTML and JavaScript thing, right? So by accessing the value attribute, we can access this text field's value, right? So go to the app component TS file. This time let's log the values instead of all HTML element. So after this, add this dot value. That's it. So save this and go to the browser. Type something and hit enter. As you guys can see here, this time we got the text fields typed value instead of the whole input tag. So how do we got this? This time we are logging this values property of this template variable. So that's why we got only the values. So guys, this is how we can capture the text fields value using the template variable. So guys, with this, we are not only capturing the value, we can also capture any attributes of this input tag with this template variable. For example, if we want to capture the ID of this text field, we can access that using the ID property. So remove this and add the ID here. Save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, this time we got the ID of this text field printed here. So like this, we can access all the attributes of HTML input tag using this template variable. So guys, this is a simple use case of a template variable. So hope you guys got the idea. Alright, so guys, in this lecture, let's study about another important topic in Angular, which is two-way data binding. So the first question is, what is this two-way data binding? Guys, simply for now, keep this in your mind. This two-way data binding is a simple approach for manipulating user input data from view to component and component to view. In other words, we use this approach to send and receive data between component files to HTML file and HTML file to component file. For example, when a user wants to edit his username and think his current username is stored inside of a username variable, for this, first thing first, we have to get the current username of the user from the component file, because we declare all the dynamic and logical stuff inside the component TS file, right? So we have to bring that current username and load it inside of an input HTML element, and we have to again send back the current edited username to the component file from the HTML input element to update and store the edited username, right? So wait, let's do this example so you guys can understand this clearly. First, let's create a variable to store the default username. So inside the app component HTML file, create a variable. The variable name something username, and this type will be string, and set a default username something John Doe. Next, what I want to do is I want to load this username inside of an input text field. So how do we do this? So let's see this. Go to the HTML component file and let's create a new HTML input field. Next, I want to set a default username to this input field. For this, we can use the property binding approach. So inside this text input tag, open and close property binding square brackets. Now inside this, we have to pass the property, which is value property. So pass it inside this. Next, assign the username variable to this. So guys, this will assign and load the username inside this text field, right? So save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, this text field loaded our default username. So how this loaded? We use the property binding for this. Okay. So now we can edit this John Doe to John Smith. So next, let's update the edited username. In order to capture this edited value, we have to use a template variable and send the value to the method. We learned about this in the previous lecture. So let's do this. Inside the input tag, first let's create a template variable. Hashtag, we define the template variable with hashtag, right? So after this, the variable name something, user name. This time, name these all simple letters. Next, let's submit this template variable to a method when click enter. For this, first we can use the keyUp event with the event filtering approach. So inside brackets, the event is keyUp and the event filter is dot enter. Next, let's call the method from this. The method name is something update user name. After this, don't forget to add the parentheses. So now pass the username template variable to this method as a parameter. Alright, so next go to the app component TS file and create this update username method. This required a parameter variable, so create that. The parameter variable is username, and this type will be HTML input element. Inside this method, let's update the edited username and replace the default username value. So our global username variable, so we access this global variable in TypeScript using this keyword, right? So this dot username assign this username parameter and dot value. So this parameter capture the input text element. So in order to capture the value, we have to access the value attribute. So this is what we did here. We learned about this in the previous lecture, right? So after this, let's log our global username. That's it. So now save this and go to the browser. Now edit this username, John Doe to John Smith. Hit enter. Inside the browser console, we got our edited John Smith user name, which means we successfully updated our default username John Doe as John Smith, right? So guys, this is how we send data from component file to HTML file and HTML file or the view to the component file. First, we loaded the default username inside this text input using the property binding. So this is what we can define as sending data from component to HTML, because this username is stored inside the component file, right? So next, in order to store the edited username, we have to again send this edited username back to the component. For this, we used the template variable and event binding approach. So in here, we used almost all binding approaches in Angular, right? So doing this data transferring between component and view, fun, but it's not easy, right? We have to go through so many steps, but we have a cleaner approach for this in Angular. So we call that approach two-way data binding in Angular. So let's look at this in detail in the next lecture. Alright guys, let's continue our journey with two-way data binding in Angular. So in the previous lecture, we learned about how to send data from the component file to HTML file and vice versa. We used property binding and event binding for this, right? But as we discussed, it's not an easy task. We have to go through so many steps. But don't worry, Angular provides us a cleaner and easier approach for this. We call this approach two-way data binding. So let's dive in. So let's go back to our app component HTML file. We have our input field here, right? So now what I want to do is I want to implement two-way data binding on this input field. So how do we do that? Very simple. Angular provides us a directive called ng-model for implementing two-way data binding. So let's see this in action. So inside the input tag, add ng-model. So now we have to wrap this inside of brackets and square brackets. So wrap this inside of brackets, then square brackets. So guys, remember this M must be capital. So after this, assign inside quotes, pass the variable name that we want to load here, which is this user name. So as you guys can see here, we are getting a compile error. What is this error? So guys, in order to use this ng model with our component, we have to import that. Otherwise, this will not work, right? So go to the app component TS file. Inside this import array, add this forms module. So guys, this ng model directive is coming from this forms module, right? So that's why we are importing this forms module here. So next, select this autocomplete. This will add the import statement automatically. We don't need to add that manually. So that's it. So guys, this will implement two-way data binding on this input field. So save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, the text field loaded our default username. How this loaded? So guys, we use two-way data binding for this, right? So now we can edit this. So John Doe to John Smith. Now let's update the edited username. In order to capture this edited value, we don't need to use template variable and send the value to method like the before. Two-way data binding will automatically update the username variable in our component file when we edit the value in this input field. So let's see this in action. So guys, for this, let's load the username variable inside the browser view. So how do we load this username variable inside the browser? For this, we can use the string interpolation approach, right? So inside the HTML file, after this text field, add an h3 tag and add the string interpolation scope. Open and close two curly brackets. Inside this, pass the variable name that we want to show inside the browser, which is this username. That's it. So save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, this loaded the default username here, John Doe. Now let's change this to John Smith. As you guys can see here, in real time, this updated the username John Doe to John Smith. So if I change this to something else, as you guys can see here, the username variable value also changed. So this is the beauty of two-way data binding. Guys, this is how we implement two-way data binding in Angular. It's a simple and clean approach for manipulating user input data from view to component and component to view. We just need to use the ng model directive and Angular will take care of the rest. So awesome, right? In the previous video, we learned about the two-way data binding. Some of you may wonder what is this two-way data binding, how this is different from this property binding, and actually what is this two-way data binding and one-way data binding. So if you look at the one-way data binding, so this one-way data binding will bind the data from the component to the view. So this one-way data binding is unidirectional. So you can only bind the data from the component to the view. Let me show you a quick example for this. Create another input tag after this input and hit enter. Input type will be text. Now I want to add value to this input. How do we do that normally? We set the value property to this input field and we'll add the value inside the quotes. Value will be something one-way data binding. So save this and back to the browser. Look at this. We got this two-way data binding inside this text field. So this is how we doing this in normal HTML. But I want to make this dynamic. So I will create a variable inside the component TS file, something text value. This V is capital. This variable's data type is string. So after this, assign a value for this. Inside quotes, something value is coming from the component. So save this now. Go to the app component HTML file. Now I want to pass the text value variable to this input. How do we do that? If you can remember, we learned earlier how to show a variable inside of this HTML view using string interpolation and property binding. Now we are dealing with this value property. So let's use the property binding method. So let's make this value property as a property binding by wrapping this inside of a square brackets. Now we are getting the value from the component. So remove this hand-coded value and add the variable name, text value. Now save this and back to the browser. Perfect. Now we got this value inside this input field. Now think if we want to capture this value when we press the enter key, like previous video example. For that, first bind the event with the event filtering for enter key. Assign it to this same onKeyApp method. Save this. Now go to the component TS file and remove this previous log and add this new log. This time log this text value variable. Save this all and back to the browser. Now we got this value inside this text field. So hit enter. Look at the browser console. In here we got this log saying value coming from the component, which is same as this. Now let's change this value to value coming from view. Now hit enter. Look at the console. This time also we got this same previous message. Again change this to something else. Still we are getting the same message. What is happening here? If you look at the code, this is passing this text value variable's value to this input with property binding. But this cannot modify this changed value and assign it to this component text value variable. That's why we are getting this same value from this log. So this is what we called one-way data binding. With this, we can only bind data from component to Weave. We cannot change this variable's value from inside of this Weave or with this HTML page. But with the two-way data binding, we can pass data from component to Weave, and also we can send data from Weave to component. Let's see this in action. Again, create another input field. Input type is text. Now bind this text value variable to this. In previous example, we did this using the property binding. This time, let's do this with the two-way data binding. We learned about this in the previous video. So open and close square brackets. Inside this again simple brackets. Inside this type ng model. So this is the special Angular syntax for two-way data binding. So after this equal sign. Now pass the variable name inside quotes. Text value. After this add this same keyup function. Copy and paste it here. Save this all and back to the browser. We got this value inside this second input as well. Now change this value to value coming from the Weave and hit enter. Look at the console. This time this value changed to this value. Again type something else and hit enter. Perfect, right? We got this value log inside the browser console. So this is the usage of two-way data binding. If we quickly recap this, with one-way data binding, we can only set data from component to Weave. We cannot modify or add changes to that data from Weave and send it back to the component. But in two-way data binding, we can pass data from component to Weave, and also we can modify that data and send it back to the component from the Weave. This string interpolation, property binding, class binding, and the style binding, all these data bindings are included into the one-way data binding category. We can only do two-way data binding using only this ng model syntax. Hope you guys got the idea.